Josie Carrow stood at the counter of Whitfield's Mercantile, her hand resting light on her son's shoulder, her mother's silver hairpin held in her other palm. Broken Bow, Nebraska Territory, October 1889. 2 hard years behind them, but Josie carried herself the way she always had, chin level, eyes clear, a woman who wore her hardship quietly and her dignity plainly. Tobias stood close beside her, 8 years old, sharp-eyed, watching the clerk add up the total the way he watched everything, closely, and without a word. "Comes to more than we'd hoped, Mrs. Carrow," Homer Pruitt said, running his pencil down the column a second time. Josie had walked in already knowing what her coin would buy, and it wasn't for her. She glanced down at Tobias's boots, the leather worn thin at the toe, and set the hairpin on the counter. "His boots matter more than my shawl," she said, steady, unhurried. "Put the rest toward the account." Tobias looked up at her. "Mama, you don't have to." "I know exactly what I have to do," she said gently, and smoothed his hair back the way she always did when she wanted him to stop worrying about her. Nathaniel Briggs stood a few feet away at the counter's end, waiting on his own freight order, and he didn't look away. He'd caught the whole exchange, the boy's protest, the mother's calm refusal to let him carry any part of her sacrifice. There was something in the steadiness of her voice that reminded him of his own father, years back, setting a pocket watch down on a counter with that same easy, practiced calm that covered something much harder underneath. He stepped forward before he'd fully decided to. "Ma'am, didn't mean to overhear, but that's a fine thing you're doing for your boy." Josie turned, measuring him plainly. Not unfriendly, just careful, the way a woman learns to be careful. "He needed boots more than I needed anything on that shelf." "Most folks wouldn't think twice to say it that plain," Nathaniel said. "I respect it." Tobias looked between the two adults with the quiet attentiveness of a boy who noticed far more than either of them expected. Nathaniel didn't know it yet, but that small exchange at the counter was only the surface of a debt that would reach his own depot before winter's end, and the woman standing in front of him was about to become someone he could not stop watching over. The grasshoppers came the summer before Ambrose died, and folks in Broken Bow still spoke of it the way other places spoke of floods or fire, a thing that arrived out of a clear sky and left the world different than it found it. They came in a cloud thick enough to dim the sun, settled over every field between the Lou and the county line, and ate 2 seasons of wheat down to bare stalk before anyone had a chance to save what they'd planted. Farmers who'd broken sod for 10 years watched their whole year go into the mouths of insects in under a week. Some packed up and went east. Most stayed, because staying was all they knew how to do, and hoped the next year would forgive them. It hadn't, not yet. Ambrose Carrow ran the smithy on the north end of Main Street back then, and business had been steady enough before the plague, shoeing horses, mending plow blades, fixing whatever iron work a working farm needed fixed. He was good at it, patient with green apprentices, careful with tools he'd saved 2 years to afford outright. Then a spooked draft horse caught him wrong one afternoon, drove a hoof into his leg below the knee, and the wound that should have healed clean turned instead. The infection took him inside a week. Josie sat with him through most of it, and didn't cry where Tobias could see, because somewhere in that week she'd made a private rule about that and never once broke it after. She kept the forge lit a while longer, hired a striker named Duncan to handle the heavier work, told herself the smithy would hold if she just kept at it steady enough. But 2 seasons of ruined harvests meant fewer farmers had horses worth shoeing, fewer tools worth mending, and the debt Ambrose had carried for stock and equipment sat in Elias Whitfield's ledger, growing quieter and heavier. With every month nobody spoke of it out loud. Whitfield hadn't called the debt due. Everyone in Broken Bow understood exactly why. A man who ran the only mercantile for 30 miles didn't need to rush a collection when winter was going to do half his work for him, when a widow with a boy to feed would have less to fight back with once the cold set in and her options thinned along with her coin. It was, in its way, a patient kind of cruelty. No raised voice, no threat spoken plain, just a number that sat and waited, and a man content to let the weather do the pressing for him. Josie didn't know yet how close that patience had run to its end, or how little time Whitfield actually intended to give her once the first snow came. What she knew was that the account needed tending, the boots needed buying, and somewhere across town a man who ran freight and stage relay had just watched her do both, without once asking for help. Nathaniel Briggs found her outside the mercantile before she'd made it a block. Mrs. Carrow. He fell into step beside her, hat in hand, the way a man does when he wants to be heard as plain business and nothing more. Word is my bookkeeper's gone off to Cheyenne for good. Married a man out there, from what I hear, and left me with a ledger I've been letting slide for 2 months now. Josie kept walking, wary the way she'd learned to be wary of men who found reasons to talk to her lately. That's so. It is. And I could use somebody sharp with figures who won't let a column sit wrong just because the day's been long. He said it plain, no softening in it. The way a man offers a fair trade and nothing more. Pays regular. Depot kitchen could use a hand too. Come to think of it, stage passengers expect a hot meal when they change horses, and I've been feeding them my own cooking, which nobody's thanked me for yet. She stopped then, studied him a long moment on the frozen street. I'd earn every dollar of it. Wouldn't take a cent I hadn't worked for. Wouldn't expect a cent less, Nathaniel said. Depot's 6 miles out, east side of town. You can start Monday if the terms suit you. They suited her fine. She threw herself into the ledger work the way she'd once thrown herself into keeping Ambrose's forge account straight. Up before the first coach came through. Columns checked twice. Nothing left for guesswork. She wouldn't let the stable boy carry the heavy ledger crates from the storeroom. Insisted on hauling them herself even when her arms shook by the third trip. When her coat cuffs frayed through in November, she didn't buy new thread from Whitfield's shelf. She pulled it instead from an old feed sack in the depot barn, sat by lamplight after her shift, and mended the tier herself, small and even, the way her mother had taught her. Nathaniel noticed. He noticed most things about her, more than he'd admit to anyone, including himself, and it wasn't only her figures that caught his attention. He'd grown up watching his own father carry a version of that same silence. The railroad had bypassed their town when Nathaniel was a boy, taken the line 20 miles south instead, and taken half the town's future with it. His father never called it a loss out loud, just quietly sold what he could, took work where he found it, and set that pocket watch on a mercantile counter one hard winter without ever once naming what it cost him to do it. Nathaniel had watched that kind of pride his whole childhood, the kind that would rather go without than admit there was anything to go without. He recognized it now in Josie Carrow the way a man recognizes whether he's weathered before. He knew exactly how far that silence could stretch before it broke something, because he'd watched it stretch in his own house first. What he hadn't yet learned was how far Josie's silence actually reached, or that someone else in that household had been watching her just as closely as he had, for a good deal longer. November tightened its grip on Broken Bow the way it did every year, slow at first, then all at once, frost thick on the depot windows by dawn, the wind finding every gap in a building's boards it could work loose. Nathaniel noticed the coat before he noticed much else that month. Josie's cuffs had worn through to near nothing, the mended thread from the feed sack holding a seam that had already given out twice. She never mentioned it, just kept working the ledgers with her sleeves pulled down over her wrists, like covering the wear made it stop being cold. He didn't say anything direct about it either. Direct wasn't going to work on a woman who'd traded her mother's hairpin sooner than ask for a shawl. Supplier sent up twice the mittens I ordered, he told her one morning, setting a pair on the ledger desk like it was nothing at all. No sense letting them sit in the storeroom. Take a pair. Josie looked at the mittens, then at him, and didn't reach for them right away. Twice the order. That's so. Happens more than you'd think. A week later it was a coat, a good wool one, heavier than anything she owned, left folded on the kitchen shelf with some story about the depot needing a spare on hand in case a coach hand got caught in a storm run without proper gear. She found him in the barn that evening and stood in the doorway with her arms crossed. You're a poor liar, Nathaniel Briggs. There's no supplier sending up spare coats nobody ordered. He didn't deny it, just kept working a strap of harness leather through his hands, not quite meeting her eye. Depot could use the extra regardless. Storm season's no time to be short. She held his gaze a long moment, something loosening in her face that hadn't loosened in a good while. Fine then, for the depot's sake. For the depot's sake, he agreed. Neither one of them said the truer thing sitting underneath it, that they'd both spent years learning to hide the exact same kind of hurt, and were only now, slow and careful, letting each other see the edges of it. What neither of them knew was that Tobias had a secret of his own, one he'd been carrying just as quietly as his mother carried hers. Most evenings after school, while Josie thought he was off with the Pruitt boy, Tobias had been sweeping stalls at the livery for whatever pocket change old man Kessler would part with. He told no one, kept the coins in a tin under a loose floorboard, counting them by candlelight, saving toward a coat of his own choosing, one he meant to give his mother himself, the way he'd watched her give things away all year without ever once asking for anything back. It was a plan built entirely on his own, born from watching her mend that thin coat one too many times, and it was about to lead him, sweeping out a stall he had no business lingering near, straight into something far more dangerous than a livery floor. The livery sat quiet most evenings, just old man Kessler and whichever boy he'd hired to muck stalls and haul feed before supper. And that quiet was exactly why Tobias didn't think twice about lingering near the back stall with a feed sack in his arms when two men walked in through the side door, talking low. He recognized Elias Whitfield's voice first. The mercantile owner had a way of talking that carried even when he meant it not to, flat and certain, like a man used to being agreed with. The second voice was one Tobias didn't know. Rougher, a stranger's voice, the kind that belonged to somebody passing through rather than somebody who lived in Broken Bow. The Carrow debt sat long enough, Whitfield was saying. Comes due before the first real snow. I want it collected clean, the forged tools if the coin's not there, and I expect it won't be. Whether the widow's still using them? The stranger asked. Collateral's collateral, Mr. Graham. Doesn't matter whose hands are on the hammer. Tobias went still in the dark of the stall, feed sack forgotten against his chest, listening the way he'd learned to listen, quiet, careful, giving nothing away. He didn't understand every piece of what he'd heard. He understood enough. Somebody meant to take his father's tools, the ones his mother still kept oiled and hung on their hooks in the shed behind their old house, out of some notion that a debt gave them the right. He didn't tell his mother, didn't tell Nathaniel either, though he thought about it walking home in the cold, breath fogging ahead of him the whole 6 miles. He thought instead about his father, feverish and thin in that last week, gripping Tobias's hand tighter than a sick man should have been able to. Watch out for your mama, Ambrose had said, voice worn down to almost nothing. She won't ask for help even when she needs it most. You watch for her, Tobias. Promise me. He'd promised. He'd kept that promise the only way an 8-year-old boy knew how, by noticing what she thought she'd hidden, by never once letting on he'd seen through every "I'm fine" she'd offered since. And now here was something bigger than a thin coat or an empty plate, something with a stranger's name attached to it and a date closing in before the snow. And Tobias decided, the quiet way children sometimes decide things far too large for them, that he would find some way to fix this himself before anyone had to know there was anything broken at all. He kept sweeping stalls, kept saving his coins in the tin under the floorboard, though he understood now, dimly, that a coat wasn't going to be enough to answer what he'd heard. Tobias believed, walking home that night, that he was the only one in that family carrying a secret too heavy to set down. He had no idea that his mother, not far behind him in worry though ahead of him in dread, was about to make a decision of her own, one that would put everything at risk, including the one man who'd spent all autumn quietly trying to help them both. Word travels faster in a small town than weather does, and by the second week of December it had reached Nathaniel by way of a supplier he'd done business with for 6 years. Heard Whitfield's been talking, the man said, not quite meeting Nathaniel's eye across the depot counter. Telling folks a depot owner harboring a debtor's family ought to think hard about who extends him credit come spring. Didn't name you outright. Didn't have to. Nathaniel felt the words land somewhere he hadn't braced for. He'd expected Whitfield's pressure to stay aimed at Josie. The debt was hers to carry, or so the town's arithmetic had it. He hadn't considered that keeping her employed might cost him his own standing with the men who kept his depot supplied and his stage line running. He said nothing to Josie about it that week, told himself he was choosing the right moment. But Broken Bow's rumor mill didn't wait on his timing, And within days Josie heard the very same words secondhand from the woman who ran the depot's laundry, that Whitfield was making Nathaniel's kindness into a liability, one credit line at a time. She didn't confront Nathaniel about it. That wasn't how she'd ever handled a debt she felt she owed. Instead, she sat with it alone the way she'd sat with every hard thing since Ambrose died, turning it over until she arrived, as she always did, at the same conclusion she'd circled toward from the very first week at the depot, that the kindest thing she could do for a man who'd been nothing but decent to her was remove herself before her presence cost him anything more. She'd done it before. Walked away from a life rather than let it drag someone else down with her. She knew exactly how to do it quietly. That night, after Tobias had gone to bed, Josie sat alone in the depot office by lamplight with a sheet of Nathaniel's own stationery in front of her, pen in hand, the wick burning low. She wrote Mr. Briggs at the top, then sat a long while before the next line came, because she found she didn't want to write it at all. I valued the work and the wage more than I can say, but I think it best, for the depot's sake and yours, that I... She stopped there. Read it back. Crossed nothing out, because crossing out would have meant admitting the words weren't already decided. Outside, the wind pushed against the office windows the same way it had pushed against Whitfield's mercantile glass 3 months before. The same cold, the same waiting season. Josie folded the unfinished letter once, set it beneath the ledger where she meant to finish it come morning, and blew out the lamp. She believed, sitting there in the dark, that she could disappear from Nathaniel's ledger the same careful, quiet way she'd disappeared from every hard year that came before it. A resignation instead of a road out of town, but the same instinct underneath it. The same old belief that the safest gift she could give the people she cared for was her own absence. She did not count on her son lying awake in the next room, turning over a secret of his own, finally deciding, that same night, for reasons that had nothing to do with hers and everything to do with a promise made at his father's bedside, that he was done carrying it alone. If you've been with us this far, you know exactly what kind of night this is about to become. Drop a comment below and tell us, do you think Josie's right to protect Nathaniel by disappearing, or is she about to make a mistake neither of them can undo? Hit like if this story has you invested, and subscribe to Sarah's Wild West Chronicles so you don't miss where Tobias's secret takes us next. Tobias heard her before he saw her, the office door easing shut, the particular quiet of a house trying not to be noticed. He'd been awake anyway, lying in the dark turning Whitfield's words over for the third night running, and something in the sound of her moving that late told him whatever she was doing, it wasn't nothing. He found her at the desk, the letter folded beneath the ledger, the lamp already out, and the room lit only by what moonlight came through the window. She startled when he spoke her name from the doorway. "You're leaving," he said. "Not a question. Tobias, it's late. Go back to. You're leaving because of what Whitfield's been saying about Mr. Briggs." He said it plain, the way he'd learned to say hard things from watching her never say them at all. "I know about the debt, Mama. I know he means to take Papa's tools. I heard him tell it to a man named Graham at the livery near 2 weeks back." Josie went very still. "You heard that and said nothing to me?" "You never say anything to me either," Tobias said, and something in his voice cracked open that he'd been holding shut for a long time. "You said you weren't hungry all last winter, and you were. You said the coat was fine when it wasn't. Papa told me before he died to watch out for you, because you'd never ask for help, even needing it most. I've been watching this whole time. I've got coins saved, near $4. I was going to buy you a coat with them, so you wouldn't have to lie about that anymore either." Nathaniel, drawn by voices at that hour, stopped in the office doorway and heard the last of it plain. The livery, the overheard scheme, the tin of saved coins, all of it landing on him at once through the one person who'd been watching Josie's sacrifices unfold from the very beginning, closer than anyone. Something in his chest went tight and clear at the same time. He'd suspected the shape of what she carried. He hadn't understood the full weight of it until a boy laid it out plain in a cold office at midnight. "Whitfield means to call the debt before the snow," Nathaniel said slowly, working it through. "And he's leaning on other merchants to isolate me from credit if I don't let her go." "That's what I heard," Tobias said. Nathaniel didn't reach for a rifle. Didn't ride for Whitfield's door with fists ready or words sharp enough to matter. He'd learned a different kind of fight from watching his own father lose everything to men who counted on nobody checking their paperwork. "Then I'll ride for the county recorder's office at first light," he said. "Every debt's got a filing behind it somewhere. I mean to see exactly what Whitfield's actually holding and what he isn't." He looked at Josie, steady. "No more letters tonight. Whatever you were writing, it can wait until I know what I'm dealing with." She didn't argue. For the first time in a long while, she let someone else carry the next step, what Nathaniel would find by the end of the following day, in a dusty ledger room 40 miles east, would undo 2 years of quiet pressure Whitfield had built one patient month at a time. Nathaniel left the depot before first light, frost thick enough on the road to crunch under the horse's hooves, his breath fogging ahead of him the whole 40 miles to the county seat. He'd made the ride before for freight business, knew the road well enough to trust the horse through the dark stretches, but he'd never made it with this much riding on the far end of it. The recorder's office opened at 8, and Nathaniel was waiting on the step when the clerk turned the key. "Land and lien filings," Nathaniel said, stamping the cold out of his boots. "Ambrose Carrow, smithy tools and stock, filed against a mercantile debt sometime around 87. The clerk pulled the county ledgers down from a shelf thick with dust, licking his thumb to turn pages that hadn't been touched in longer than Nathaniel cared to guess. Minutes stretched into most of an hour, the clerk running his finger down column after column of filings, while Nathaniel stood with his hat in his hands and made himself wait quiet, the way a man waits when the waiting is the only part of the fight left to him. "Here's your Carrow entry," the clerk said finally, tapping a faded line. "Debt's recorded plain enough, but the lien against the tools and forged stock." He frowned, turned back a page, then forward again. "There's no witness signature on this. No county seal. Whoever drew this collateral claim up never filed it proper. Not through this office, anyway." Nathaniel felt something settle into place, quiet and certain, meaning the claim on the tools. Meaning it's not worth the paper it's written on, far as this county's concerned. A debt's a debt, but you can't seize a man's tools as collateral on a lien that was never legally recorded. Whoever's been telling folks otherwise has been counting on nobody riding out here to check. Nathaniel asked for a certified copy on the spot, watched the clerk stamp it twice, and rode back toward Broken Bow at a pace that had the horse lathered by the second hour. He timed his return without meaning to. As he came up the road past the old smithy, he saw them already there. Otis Graham and 2 men he didn't recognize, seizure papers in hand, standing in front of the shed where Ambrose Carrow tools still hung oiled and waiting on their hooks, exactly where Josie had kept them all this time. Elias Whitfield had spent 2 full years building quiet pressure on a debt he had never actually held the legal right to collect. Patient, careful, certain nobody would think to ride 40 miles and look. He was about to find out, in front of whatever part of Broken Bow happened to be watching Main Street that morning, exactly how wrong that certainty had been. By the time Nathaniel swung down off his horse, a dozen or so of Broken Bow had already gathered along the road above the shed, folks drawn out of the mercantile and the diner and the church hall by the sight of 2 strange men and Otis Graham standing in front of the Carrow smithy with papers in hand. Whitfield's name carried weight in that town, for better and worse, and word that his collector had come calling had a way of pulling people out into the cold to watch. Josie stood near the front of it, Tobias close beside her, both of them still as the frost on the ground. Graham had the seizure papers unfolded, reading off the debt total to nobody in particular, when Nathaniel stepped up onto the shed step between him and the door. "Mr. Graham." Nathaniel's voice carried easy across the gathered crowd, calm, unhurried, no rifle in his hands, no need for one. "Before you touch anything in that shed, I'd ask you to look at something." He held out the certified copy from the recorder's office. Graham took it, frowning, and Nathaniel let the silence sit while the man read. "That's the full filing record on the Carrow smithy debt," Nathaniel said. "Debt's real enough, nobody's disputing that, but the lien against these tools was never witnessed, never recorded with the county. Not in 87, not since, which means whatever paper you're holding right now claiming a right to seize this collateral isn't worth the ink on it." Graham's jaw tightened. That's a matter for the courts to sort out. It is, Nathaniel agreed, still even, still calm. And I'd be glad to see it sorted there, in front of a judge, with this certified copy entered plain for the record. What I won't do is stand here and watch you carry off a widow's tools on a claim your own employer never bothered filing right because he was counting on nobody writing out to check in 2 years' time. The crowd had gone quiet in the particular way a crowd goes quiet when it senses which way something is about to fall. Graham looked at the paper again, looked at the gathered faces watching him, and found, for the first time since he'd ridden into Broken Bow, that his certainty had nowhere left to stand on. He folded the seizure papers back into his coat without another word, mounted up, and rode off toward the mercantile with his 2 men behind him, leaving the tools hanging exactly where they'd hung all along. Within 3 days, 2 other families in Broken Bow, the Hollisters and old Ezra Mott, came forward with strikingly similar stories of their own. Debts Whitfield had let compound quietly for years against collateral that had never once been properly filed. What had held Broken Bow's fear in place for so long, it turned out, was never the debts themselves. It was the assumption that nobody would think to check. Justice, this time, hadn't come from a raised gun or a hard word spoken in anger. It had come from a piece of paper sitting forgotten in a dusty county office for 2 years, waiting on somebody to finally write out and read it. Now it was time to see what came after, for Whitfield, for the town, and for the 2 people who'd found, in each other, something neither had let themselves ask for in a long while. Christmas came to Broken Bow quiet and cold, the way it did most years, snow banked along Main Street, and smoke rising steady from every chimney in town. The smithy stayed Josie's, the county's certified copy had settled that plain enough, and Whitfield, for his part, had gone strangely careful about pressing anyone for anything since the Hollisters and Ezra Mott brought their own ledgers forward. On Christmas morning, Tobias handed his mother a paper-wrapped bundle without any speech to go with it, the way he'd watched her hand things over all year. No ceremony, no fuss made of what it cost him to give it. Josie unwrapped it slow. A coat, good wool, plain but sturdy, exactly the kind she'd have never once let herself buy. Nearly $4. Tobias said, watching her face. Sweeping stalls at Kessler's since October. I wanted you to have one you didn't have to lie about. Josie held the coat a long moment, then reached into her apron pocket and pressed something small and cool into his palm instead. Her mother's silver hairpin, the very one she'd traded across Whitfield's counter months before, quietly bought back with her first depot wages and kept hidden since. Keep it, she told him, for whatever you'll need it for someday. You've more than earned the keeping of it. Later that evening, at the depot, Nathaniel found her by the kitchen stove, the new coat already hung by the door. Fine coat, he said. Fine liar's son, Josie said, and there was warmth enough in it now that neither of them needed to pretend otherwise. Guess the tendency runs in more than one family. Nathaniel almost smiled at that. Guess it does. Neither one said anything grander than that. There didn't need to be a declaration made of it. Just an understanding, settled quiet between them the same way the coat and the mittens had settled it weeks before, one small kindness at a time until neither of them had to hide much of anything left. A few days later, Josie stood again at Whitfield's counter, coin in hand. Homer Pruitt waited on her the same as always. Just the one thing today, Mrs. Carrow? She looked past him at the shelf, at the very shawl she'd passed over back in October, and this time she didn't look away from it. Just the one, she said. For myself. Homer wrapped it without comment, and Josie walked out into the cold with something bought for no one but her. I want to sit with you a moment before we close this one out, because stories like this one have a way of finding somebody's face in the audience, whether you expect it or not. Has someone in your life ever told you, nothing for myself, and meant it every single time? A mother or father, somebody who gave without ever once asking to be seen giving? If this story brought a face to mind, tell us about them in the comments below. We read every one. And if you want more stories like Josie and Tobias's, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss the next journey out of Sarah's Wild West Chronicles. Thanks for riding along with us today, friends. We'll see you in the next one.